Everybody, today we are going to be learning about Grant's presidency and the election of 1876. By the end of this video, you should be able to tell me what policies and scandals defined Grant's presidency. You should be able to tell me what the results of the election of 1876 were. You should be able to tell me about the terms of the Compromise of 1877. You should be able to explain the effects of this compromise and the end of Reconstruction on the South. And you should be able to define the following important terms: Redeemer government, Jim Crow laws, and Plessy versus Ferguson. Ulysses S. Grant had been a great general, but he turned out not to be a great president. He had very little political experience and really didn't understand how things worked in Washington, D.C. One of his major policies that he pursued while in office was to support radical Reconstruction. One reason for this is that Grant realized that he owed his seat in the White House to Southern black voters, and so he took measures to make sure that they would be able to continue voting. One way he did this was through the Force Acts, which allowed the federal government to go and fight the Ku Klux Klan and resulted in the arrest of many Klansmen. But Grant's presidency was also marred by some major scandals that made a lot of people think that he didn't really know what was going on. One of the major ones was the Credit Mobilier scandal. You can just say the Credit Mobilier scandal. Nobody's going to correct you about that. And in this scandal, a railroad company was able to trick the government into hiring it for super high prices, and then was able to use parts of its insane profits to bribe Congress not to tell anybody. And so a lot of people made a whole lot of money before this case actually leaked, and then a lot of people were in trouble and looked really bad. Another case that made Grant look like he didn't really know what was going on was the whiskey ring scandal. And in the whiskey ring, what happened is a lot of Grant's cronies, people employed by Grant, were able to steal millions of dollars from taxes on whiskey that were supposed to go to the government. They basically just pocketed this money. And both of these scandals had the result of making people think Grant was not really paying attention. On top of this, there was the Panic of 1873, and this was another one of those economic collapses where basically banks fail and people lose a lot of their property. And the economy collapsing always makes the president look bad. And so this really makes Grant look bad, and it weakens the Republicans in the upcoming elections. So after Grant's 2 terms are up, we move on to the election of 1876, and this is between the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and the Democrat Samuel J. Tilden. Now, Rutherford B. Hayes is pretty much unknown, and at this point, his main qualification is that he comes from the important state of Ohio, which gives a lot of votes, and he also has an awesome beard, as you can see in that picture there. The Democrat Samuel J. Tilden stands for the end of Reconstruction, and he also says that he's trying to fight against Republican corruption as seen in Grant's government. The results for this come back mixed because 4 states basically don't return results that are clear. So it's impossible to tell who wins the election, which had been very, very close. And because there's no fair way to settle this dispute, the Democrats and the Republicans decide that they're going to compromise. The Compromise of 1877 results with both sides getting some of what they wanted. On the one hand, the Republicans get the White House, and Rutherford B. Hayes becomes president. On the other hand, the Democrats get an end to Reconstruction in the South, that is, the North pulls out all of its troops and lets the South do its own thing. And they also get the promise of a railroad that will connect the South to California, which never happens. And this compromise represents the final end of Reconstruction in the South. So after about 10 years, the North has given up and is going to let the South do its own thing. Of course, letting the South do its own thing doesn't work out very well for Southern African Americans. So after Reconstruction ends, the South can basically go back to its old system of racial oppression. Of course, it can't reintroduce slavery, but there's still plenty of other things that Southern whites can do to ensure that African Americans do not get a fair share of the Southern economy. And the first step is violence, which we've already talked about. Southern whites use violent tactics to scare away black voters. This involves both the KKK and public lynchings, as we've already mentioned. What this results in is the return of all-white governments to the South. These all-white governments are able to pass laws to eliminate black voting entirely. Laws including the grandfather clause, which says that your grandfather had to be able to vote if you're allowed to vote. Also, they passed the poll tax, which eliminates poor voters, both black and white, and literacy requirements that also limit the ability of poor African American citizens to vote. And so this basically eliminates black people from voting in the South for another 90 years. And so on top of this, we see the passage of segregation laws, known as Jim Crow laws. And these basically designate different spaces and different buildings for black people and white people, with white people having access to much better facilities than black people. And at first, this is viewed as unconstitutional, but the Supreme Court decides in the case Plessy versus Ferguson that it actually is legal as long as the facilities are separate but equal. Of course, the facilities are not equal, and segregation continues in the South until the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, when it finally ends. So basically, Reconstruction fails. The South goes back to being a system in which whites oppress Southern blacks, and it stays this way for another 90 years. Alright guys, that's it for this video. Now you should be able to answer these questions.